afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see so many of you here. Welcome to this panel with the bold title, Another World is Possible. Really looking forward to the conversation, hoping you all get stuck in as well. My name's Sophia Parker. I'm the Emerging Futures Director at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So, what brings us all here today? Some of you may have been at our previous panel that we've just held exploring the state of poverty in the UK today. And there's no question that we face some pretty serious challenges. Rising inequality, deepening poverty, concentration of wealth, rapidly changing demographic and technological developments. And that's before we even get to the climate emergency. And it's hard to look in the face of those things, isn't it, without descending into fatalism, despair. And so what we want to talk about today is how can we hold on to a sense of hope despite this polycrisis, this many very challenging things that we all face. How can we hold on to hope in the face of those challenges? How can we hold on to a sense of possibility that it doesn't have to be this way? Rebecca Solnit talks about hope as an animating force of action. Hope that isn't just about wishful thinking, which is what it sometimes gets written off as, but rather she argues that without hope, we won't act. We won't believe that another world is possible. So we've got an amazing panel today to explore some of these questions. And I'm so grateful to all of them for being here. Well, Rob isn't quite here. He's here on a screen. Unfortunately, trains got in the way. So Rob is joining us from Totnes. Rob, it's lovely to have you here. Thanks for being here. Rob is the co-founder of the Transition Network and of Transition Town Totnes. He's also the author of a number of books, including one you can purchase here today, From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want. So Rob, thanks for joining despite the travel challenges. We also have Jake Garber. Jake is a maker and facilitator and the co-director of a company called Canopy. And Canopy supports groups of people to unlock their collective creative power for regeneration. So thanks for coming. Jake's joining us from London. Bob Doherty is the Dean of the School for Business and Society at the University of York. He's also the lead investigator on a 5-year programme called Fix Our Food, which explores how we can transition the current food system to a more regenerative one. So, Bob, lovely to have you here. And finally, Yasmin Dabi. Yasmin is the Director of Evolving Leadership, and she's also a collaborator with New Constellations, which is an organisation dedicated to working with people to create better, more brilliant futures. She's working with New Constellations and actually also with Joseph Rowntree Foundation on a very exciting project in York, here in York, so she's going to talk a little bit more about that as well. Just before we get started, though, I kind of want to get all of us in the room into a space of believing that another world is possible, or at least thinking about what that other world might be. So I just want to invite you just to take a couple of minutes to imagine a world, imagine York in 10 years' time. Imagine that we've had this amazing period of creativity and collaboration, that we've done everything we possibly can to move towards more equitable and just futures where people and planet can thrive. Imagine everything's gone right. And I want you just to think for a minute and turn to your neighbour and talk about what you think you might see in that York of 2033, where everything has gone right and we are moving towards futures where we have dealt with some of the challenges that we're facing today. So just a couple of minutes and I might see if anyone wants to share before we then move into the panel discussion. Off you go. I'm going to ask you to come back into the room. Thank you. I hope that was an enjoyable experience, if a brief one. I'd love to just hear from a couple of people what they talked about for this York in 2033. We've got some microphones along the side, so please, if you'd like to share just a couple of words on what you've talked about, raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. Don't be shy. Lovely, thank you. Lady over here.
Hello, I was talking to my lovely neighbour who's involved in a couple of food banks, and we were talking about how often people aren't even coming forward for help. They're being referred on, by district health workers was this example. And so we were talking about like a sense of community, but almost more than that, like a sense of solidarity. So people felt able to be open about challenges they're facing, and then were met by people like actually open-handedly, compassionately wanting to help and support, like directly, openly, in solidarity with them.
Solidarity is a really powerful word. Thank you. Thank you. And I saw a hand go up over here. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we jumped really quickly to solutions. So there was two things we talked about. One was transport and how you can have so much better public transport, but that actually works for everyone and makes the city centre better, but also the areas around York. And we talked about affordable housing and just the need for more housing, better affordable housing across York and Yorkshire, really.
Thank you. A roof over everyone's head. Yeah. Anyone else like to share one? Lovely, thank you. Oh, just wait for the microphone so that everyone can hear. Thank you.
Paying tax is no longer a dirty word.
Very nice.
You're proud to pay tax.
Yes, proud to pay tax. Lovely. Thank you for those. Well, I hope you all hold on to those thoughts as we go into this session and as you listen to these wonderful contributions that are coming up. So, another world is possible. Rob, would you like to kick us off?
Well, yes. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Is there a thumbs up? Beautiful. So, yeah, lovely to see you all. And I'm sorry not to be able to be with you in person, but solidarity with the rail workers. And sorry that I missed out on seeing you all. Sorry, my phone is ringing. So, yes, I'm part of one of the people who started the transition movement, which started down here in Totnes in Devon in 2005, 2006, and which you can now find in 50 different countries around the world. And that's really about what we can do where we are with the people that we have, the passion that we have, the resources that we have. If we think that in terms of the climate emergency, there is no cavalry coming to the rescue, and we are that cavalry. And I recently read a survey that said that about 70% of people thought that climate change was urgent and we needed to act, but only about 15% of people actually believed we could do anything about it. It's like we've gone straight from waking up smelling smoke to just ringing the insurance company. There's a bit in between that where you actually run around and try and do something. And so for me, I've been spending the last 3 or 4 years really looking at, well, what is that gap and how do we bridge that gap? And I've really been doing a lot of work around this idea of longing, and that we really need to work with longing. And the novelist Don DeLillo once said, longing on a large scale is what makes history. Longing on a large scale is what makes history. And I think we often forget that in our activism. If we just imagine that talking about collapse and extinction are somehow going to be enough to cultivate that longing, then I think we're kind of fooling ourselves. And the climate emergency is such a vast challenge that goes way beyond the idea that we can just switch everything over to electric cars. That David Holmgren, who's a co-founder of permaculture, talks about the stories that we tell ourselves at this moment in history. He says there's one of them, which is that sort of Elon Musk idea that technology can just solve everything and that we'll all go to Mars and travel through space and we can solve everything. Another one he calls techno stability, which is the idea that we can still have a consumerist growth-based society. We'll just run it on solar panels and we'll all drive electric cars instead. And there are so many resource constraints to that. And I think that the degrowth movement's analysis of that is really powerful. Another scenario is what is collapse, this idea of collapse. I spend a lot of time in Belgium and France, where there's a very powerful movement called the collapsologist movement, who talk about collapse as being a very real scenario. My work has always been around the fourth one, which we call energy descent, which is the idea that we need to be moving to using less and less energy very urgently, but seeing that as a way to move towards something better. This will only work if where we end up is a better place than where we start. Rather than being dragged away from something irreplaceable, it needs to feel like we're moving towards something irresistible and historic and delicious and extraordinary. And of course, this ties in with poverty as well. If we tackle climate change in the right way, it will hugely benefit the lives of most people. people. I went to an amazing town in France called Grand Sainte near Dunkirk, where the mayor's approach to climate change was that everything they did had to benefit the poorest people in that place first. And the actions that they took were really, really inspirational and incredible. And recently, the United Nations published a report where they said any chance of staying below 1.5 degrees is now over unless we see what they called a rapid transformation of society. And so all the magazine articles, all the headlines led with saying 1.5 is over. There were no headlines that said, let's do a rapid transformation of society thing. Let's do that. And so that's what I try and do, is how do we use imagination and to cultivate longing in that way. And I love the Institute for the Future in America. On their window, it says, any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. So I spend a lot of my time when I do talks saying to people, please, please be as ridiculous as you can. We have reached a time when any strategies and solutions that believe we can move in little incremental steps are nowhere near ambitious enough. And that actually we need to feel much more like, if your ideas aren't a bit ridiculous, you need to up your game and up your ambition. And so my work recently in the last couple of years around this idea of longing has been really inspired by a t-shirt that I saw a young woman wearing at the Black Lives Matter protest in Washington in 2020, which said, I've been to the future, we won. It gave me goosebumps. I thought it was just beautiful. And how different would our activism be if that's how we approached it? If you could say, I've been to 2030, I'm going to tell you all about it. It was absolutely incredible. And so here in Totnes, which some of you might know, small town in South Devon, you may know many things about this. What you probably don't know is that we have a very secret program here where we've recently perfected building an actual working time machine, which I think deserves an ooh, because we've been working on this thing and it's fantastic. And we regularly take trips into 2030, not utopia, not dystopia, but the 2030 that resulted from us doing absolutely everything we possibly could do. And so as part of that, I often have to put this thing on here because not to protect me, you see, it's actually to protect the places that we go, so that we don't, when we get there, contaminate them with our sort of 2023 pessimism and kind of past splaining, but rather we're just there to observe what they're actually doing. And I often use this. It was inspired in part by the great Sun Ra, the jazz musician, who said, we've tried the possible and it failed. Now it's time to try the impossible, by Bell Hooks, who said, what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. And an amazing woman called Rashida Phillips in the US, who runs a project called Black Quantum Futurism, where she uses time travel as a tool to unlock different possibilities. So I use this time machine in many different ways. I use it with audiences at events. I use it on my podcast, and I invite people to travel with me. And so my talks increasingly become like me presenting myself as the Marco Polo of the climate movement, who has just got back from an adventure to 2030 and is going to tell you all about it. And I tell people the tales of the car-free neighborhoods that I've been to visit. And when I go to all these, we go there to make recordings, because I think if you could make a recording of what those places sound like and bring them back to people in 2023 and play them, this is what York is going to sound like. I've been there. Listen, it's amazing. It sounds like this. And we go and visit underground mushroom farms in Brussels, where they're growing mushrooms for food and protein and leather and for construction materials. We visit landscapes rewilded by beavers. We visit the bicycle rush hour in Utrecht. My friends, if you ever lose hope in the future, go and listen to the bicycle rush hour in Utrecht. We go to visit all sorts of places, and then we bring the recordings back and we bring those stories back, and we try and use them to kind of and a future in which people who have had to move are welcomed when they arrive as well. And so we bring those stories and we share them and use them in workshops. And what's lovely that I find is a very different quality to working in that way to just telling people about information and facts. I recently gave a talk at a big conference at the British Association for Sustainable Sport. And the first question at the end, this woman said, Rob, when you were in 2030, did you see a lot of repair cafes and stuff? And I said, firstly, I just love the idea that you have suspended your disbelief to the point where it's like you're asking me kind of, oh, Rob, I heard you were in Paris last week. Can you recommend a good cafe? And one guy wrote to me online and said, Rob, I hear you've built a time machine. Could you please share your plans with me? And I had to write back to him and say, you do realize you can't actually build a time machine. And he wrote back and said, you may be right. I thought, well, I think I probably am. So what we do then with that is that we use those recordings. I'm working with an amazing musician called Mr. Kit, and we make these kind of ambient electronic soundscapes. And my brief to him is that they need to cultivate a nostalgia for the future, inspired by Rilke, who said the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And I think that what I love seeing in the transition movement and in sort of activism circles, and I know that Yasmin is going to talk about the work of New Constellations, which I think is one of the most exemplary, beautiful uses of the cultivation of longing and imagination. I think donut economics does it really well as well, by identifying the sweet spot and then saying, be imaginative within this space, because the imagination loves limits. I love seeing the work that Phoebe Tickell is doing in London with the Imagination Activist training, working with Camden Council to train people in that organization to be the imagination activists who are working there. I love seeing it when organizations do what I call pop-up tomorrows, where they create now what the future could be like so people can interact with it and touch it and smell it and feel it. And I heard recently about a great bit of activism in Paris where campaigners opposing Total's pipeline they're trying to build through Uganda went out one morning into this whole neighborhood of Paris, put letters to everybody's letterbox saying, oh, terribly sorry, but your house is going to be demolished to make way for a pipeline. And they marked out in blue chalk on all the streets where the pipeline was going to go, and with a phone number. And then when people rang up to say, what do you mean you're going to knock my house down? People got the same speech that people in Uganda are getting when they get those letters to say they're going to get their houses knocked down. So bringing the future into the present is very powerful. I think the creation of what if spaces. And just to wrap up, because I've nearly used my time, but I just wanted to finish by saying I think the thing that we often lose sight of is that a lot can happen in a very short period of time. We know the next 10 years is going to be a period of massive change and upheaval. If we do nothing, that's what will happen. So we need to be there shaping and making that what it is. There's a beautiful book called Imaginable, where she lists all the things that have changed within 10 years. It took 10 years from Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat to the Civil Rights Act being passed, 10 years from the first international sanctions on South Africa to the new constitution, and there are many, many, many of those. And I love, you talked about, Sophia, at the beginning about hope. And my favorite quote about hope is Peter Kalmus, the great climate scientist in the US, who is one of the most brilliant campaigning scientists, who, when he was asked what gives him hope, he says, the fact that we've barely tried yet. The fact that we've barely tried yet. And so for me, I feel like in my experience, when we create those opportunities for people to step into the future, when we work on the longing, then rather than trying to push people to change, which has been our experience as activists and campaigners forever, if you get the longing part right, what you do is you kind of throw a whirlpool in front of people that starts to pull us towards it. And that's what longing can do that I think not many other things can do. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. And yeah, I didn't realise you were visiting us from 2030, so it's very exciting to have you back here. Jake, over to you.
Thanks, Sophia. So yeah, really building on what Rob's just shared with us. So my name is Jake. I work at an organisation called Canopy, which is set up to help people connect to their own imaginative power to build alternative futures, alternative to the ones that are staring us in the face right now. I want to talk about 4 different things. I want to talk about how imagination is for everybody. Secondly, I want to talk about where is imagination happening now? How is it happening? Then I want to talk about what does it mean to work with imagination? And I think Rob's given us some great examples of that. And then lastly, I want to talk about a network that we're setting up with support from Joseph Rowntree Foundation to support people who want to work with imagination. That might be any of you in this room, to develop their practice and make it even more powerful. So first of all, imagination is for everyone. Sophia kicked us off by asking you to imagine York of the future. I was going to do something much more frivolous and ask you just to look at the ceiling and just imagine it was full of red balloons, sort of big glossy balloons with ribbons dangling down. I believe everybody in this room can do that. because we are born with an innate power for imagination. We have this ability to imagine things that are not here but that we can create. And even though we talked about balloons, this is deadly serious. The statistics that I read said that 7,500 children in this city are living in poverty right now. Millions of people globally are dying from climate change. The world that we have imagined is in the process of collapse. So unless we examine our current processes of imagination and explore new ones, we can't change course. So imagination is for everyone, but do we know how to use it? First, let's look at how imagination is currently happening. So let's take one example. A group of MPs in a private WhatsApp group making massive policy decisions. What they're doing is they're imagining a world in which a small select group of people get to make enormous decisions which affect many of us with little personal experience and little accountability. That is one of the imaginations that is currently in power. So I don't believe that imagination is something extra to reality. I believe that we are always enacting an imagination. There's a poet and activist who I particularly like called Sophia Manzoor Khan, who gives two other examples of imagination in practice. One is of a mother asking her children to share their toys. And Sophia says, in that action, she's imagining a world where the things that we have, we hold in common. She gives the example of a refugee seeking sanctuary, going from their home to another country, and in their action, imagining a world without borders. So, not only is imagination for everyone, we're living it all of the time. It's a question of practice. What are we practicing? What is this imagination that we're living out? So the questions that I work with are, how do we democratize imagination? How do marginalized imaginations gain power? And how do we imagine across difference, not just in our bubbles, in our safe places, but how do we imagine with others who are different to us? So, to bring it to life, much as Rob did, I want to talk about some examples from my work. So, and to talk about some imagination practice, that means a way of working with imagination. So one of the ways that we like to use particularly, amongst quite a few, is working with myth and traditional story. Now, apparently, the average scientific paper has been read, on average, by 6 people. Myths and traditional stories have passed through generations from mouth to ear thousands of times, and the wisdom that they contain has been distilled through that process. Now, we find that working with myths and traditional stories creates a different kind of space, and I think that's some of what Rob is talking about, a space that you can step into. Now, we use this in a project we've been doing in South London around health inequalities. Health inequalities, 15 years between the most privileged, the age at which they die, and the most disadvantaged. It's an extremely angering situation. A group of community activists, medics and residents got together and they said they wanted to do something different. We worked with a traditional story called Jumping Mouse, which was this beautiful story. And what happens is when you go into the story, people's experience, people's knowledge is kind of equal. People are able to situate themselves within the story and disrupt some of the dynamics, some of the power dynamics, some of the established ways of having conversations that so often just go round and round and round in circles, and I know that you've all been in those conversations. And this supported them to shift from an imaginary which is not supporting the community, a myth of the individual, that health is located in the individual, into something more collective. And they've created this system that they call the household model, which involves households coaching each other, But they needed a safe space to develop that, because when we're thinking about the future, when we're thinking about the things we need, we don't know what it is yet, and it's vulnerable to the kind of headwind of the status quo. And what the story did was it created a space where people could think together and make practical decisions about how they're going to do things. And this is having a big impact on families, and that's the reason that it's now attracting investment from NHS England and is starting to grow. And it's because we've seen this impact of working with imagination that we are developing this network for people who want to work with imagination, and that's supported by Sophia and the people at Joseph Rowntree Foundation. When I talk about imagination practitioners, what I mean is people who want to help us to step into a wider sense of possibility and to translate that into action. And I really believe that many of you in the audience are either already those people or would like to be those people. So far, we've recruited 8 practitioners who are going to host peer learning journeys over a series of months where people are going to do experiments and they're going to learn from each other about how to do this. And you could all apply to be part of those huddles, we're calling them. And we also have public events so you can hear from other places about what they're doing and how they're doing it. Because I think what's really important here is that we get really practical, that we find ways of doing things, we find tools, we find ways of working that support us to do this, not just that it wouldn't be a grand idea, but actually we need to take action right now in our communities. So I would welcome you all joining us in that. It would be lovely to see you there. I want to close with a quote. And I've written lots of notes, but I haven't written down the name of the person that it's from, so there you go. You'll have to come back to me on that one. But I think for me it sums up why this is so important. So it says, myths are like air, invisible until you realise you live inside them and thrive or die according to their limitations. When we hear the word myth, we think of heroes and battles, but patriarchy is a myth, as is heteronormativity and capitalism and human supremacy. Civilization is a myth, and it is within these imperceptible yet encompassing narrative structures that we now find ourselves stuck like flies in a spider's web. It's through imagination that the myths of our time are made and can be remade. We can do better, but it will take imagination. And I want to know, how will you use this wonderful power of imagination that you were born with next? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think this idea of encouraging us to see things that perhaps feel fixed and immutable as changeable is such an important step into moving towards this kind of expanded sense of possibility as we're facing some of these huge challenges. Bob, you're going to talk a bit about the work you're doing in food, so
Sure.
Bringing it into a kind of very specific issue.
Sure. And thanks, Sophia, and thanks, Jake and Rob, for great talks. And thanks, everybody, for giving up your afternoon to come and listen to us. It's really a privilege to speak to everyone. I'm Bob Doherty, and I'm from the School for Business and Society at the University of York. But I also run a research programme that's called Fix Our Food, which is about transformations to a regenerative Yorkshire food system. So I'm going to talk about some problems, but then I'm going to talk about some examples of hope. And I think the key problem I want to talk about is food poverty, and I know a number of people here who are working in food banks. So please don't see this as a criticism of the people who work in food banks. It's a criticism of poverty and the way that the food poverty and food aid has grown in the UK. So I don't know whether anybody's aware of actually the scale of the problem. You probably are. There's people who work in food banks will be. We're now at a time that actually this year, the number of emergency parcels that food banks have given out is 40% higher than the pandemic. Yeah, shocking statistic. Also, I've done some crunching of data, and actually the food banks now are the second largest food store in the United Kingdom. There's 2,811 food banks in the UK. That's Trussell Trust plus independent food banks. It's more than the number of Sainsbury's, Asda and Morrison stores put together. Yeah, that's incredible. It's actually nearly the number of Tesco's stores in the UK. There's 2,837 Tesco's stores in the UK, and there's 2,811 food banks. So in 12 months' time, actually, I predict there'll be more food bank stores in the UK than Tesco stores. You know, it's sobering thought, really. And just imagine a world. You don't have to really go that far back in history to imagine a world. If you go back to 2010, does anybody know how many food banks there were in the UK in 2010? Anybody want to guess? Nearly 35 food banks in 2010. So we don't have to really go far back in history to imagine a world when we had that. From 2017 to now, the number is doubled. So we've seen a rapid rise. But the people who work in food banks are doing a fantastic job. You know, they're volunteers. They're responding to a need. And the problem is not the food bank. The problem is systemic poverty. And that's what we've been talking about today. And I just want to show you something behind on the screen, which is that I don't normally, as an academic, use clips from the Daily Mirror, but I am going to do today. But is it something to be proud of? You know, this photo opportunity that politicians use to be proud of standing outside a food bank, is it something really to be proud of? No, it isn't. And so we need to imagine a different future where we don't feel proud about doing that. You know, and I know that food bank organisations have a mission, the Trussell Trust is one of them, to eradicate food banks. They don't want food banks in the United Kingdom. And I just think that's a reminder that it's not always been that way. You know, as I said, back in 2010 there was 35. So let's look at some projects of hope, some imaginations really here. And I'm going to take two examples, one from the City of York, and there are a number of examples I could take from the City of York, but I'll take one and then one from the City of Liverpool. So the one from the City of York is in Tang Hall. It's Food Circle in Tang Hall Community Centre, and within Fix Our Food we do a lot of work with Joe Fennerty. We started to involve him in our procurement, in our university campus procurement, because it aggregates lots of fresh produce from all over the Vale of Pickering, Vale of York and Yorkshire Wolds that would otherwise go to waste. And he provides it for the local community in a market, in the car park in Tang Hall Community Centre. And he also makes meals on a daily basis, big broths, big soups for the healthy food for the local community. And for me, he's a bit of a food hero. And there are a number of these kind of people all over the country trying to make a difference. And we're in the hunger gap, aren't we? That moment between winter, you know, and the kind of harvest. And what he does, he ferments, he pickles lots of produce that was harvested last year in the meals he provides for the local community. The other example is squash, which is based in Toxteth on Winsford Street in Liverpool. And this again is another community food hub. When you go in there they make superb food, very, very healthy food. When you go in there as a customer, you can choose to pay 10, 20, 30, 40% more for your meal. And then that money is used to provide a meal for other people in the community. And you're sitting down, and all people from all demographics, all different circumstances, are sitting in that cafe having a meal. Really, really good meal. And this is, I think we need to imagine a world where we're redistributing wealth. This gentleman here mentioned about tax not being a dirty word. I'll come to tax in a moment. But this is a great example. They have an urban growing project. Everybody gets involved in volunteering, working out how to grow produce as well in the urban environment. So those are two great examples of community responses. The other one is free school meals. 30% of children if during term time, 30% of the food and drink that children consume is consumed in schools. So free school meals are important. And I just want to commend Sadiq Khan, who's the Mayor of London, for actually using the business tax, the business rate, to fund free school meals across the whole of London, across the whole of the primary school network in London. And and we'd like to see that across the whole of England, and we're lobbying the government at the moment to do that. And the devolved nations of Wales and Scotland are doing that anyway, so why isn't England? You know, it's a real problem. And we've also been lobbying the government, and there's something that was in the National Food Strategy that Henry Dimbleby wrote, was a 2% tax on corporations that make high-fat, sugar-salt foods. And that 2% tax would then be used to get fresh produce into disadvantaged communities. And people misunderstood it. People thought it was a tax for consumers. It was a tax on companies. And the government ignored it. But it would really ignite some of these community projects in these kind of areas that are suffering and experiencing food poverty. Now we've set up a platform called Leaders for Change with the Food Foundation. It's 72 schools from Keighley and Bradford all the way through to Scarborough. And we're giving children a say in their own food system, because children are the future in terms of what they imagine what a future food system would look like. And we surveyed them, and they came up with 5 big requests. We aggregated all the data, and we put it on a postcard, and you can see here behind me, the postcard up on there on the right, and we sent it to every member of Parliament in the whole of Yorkshire. And somebody said the importance of advocacy, the importance of tax, the importance of advocacy are all important in this space to try and transform the Yorkshire food system to a more regenerative food system. And believe it or not, we never got one response from any MP, which is very, 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 very poor, I think. But this story is not going away. These young people are really passionate about the future of their food system and their own school food system. And we've given them a chance to have a say in what their food system should look like in schools. And they're getting rid of sugary cereals from breakfast clubs, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I've gone on for far too long, and Sophia's telling me to stop. So thank you very much, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Bob, and the subtle cue worked. Thank you, that was fascinating, and just, I think, I would love, maybe we can come back to it, to hear more about what children were talking about as the future they hoped for in relation to food, so thank you. Yasmin, last but definitely not least, over to you. You're going to talk a bit about how we might apply some of this sense of expanding possibility in place, and specifically here in York.
In York, yeah. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my background and where I come from and what I've learned from that, because it links. Then talk about New Constellations, the people that I collaborate with that Rob mentioned. And then talk about the bit that I'm sure you're really interested in, which is York and the journey that we're planning for York, and tell you a bit more about that. So I run a company called Evolving Leadership, and in that really, it's a very future-focused work that I've been doing for the last 20 plus years, but more in the corporate sector, and also with non-governmental organizations, social enterprises, etc. But it's all based, it was all worked on helping individuals, teams, and organizations make the next step into the future. So helping them develop, grow, expand into an upgraded version of themselves. And what I've noticed in that work is that there's 2 things that are really fundamental to that. One is it's always systemic. Change is always systemic because it's in relationship with the other parties, the things that you're trying to achieve. You're needing to put people into relationship with those things. So it's understanding those dynamics is fundamental to change happening. And the second one is that we often think about the change we want to make, but we don't think about the conditions that the change requires in order for the change to be able to come forth. And so the conditions are the bit that often gets forgotten. The people need to feel able to talk openly. They need to feel safe. They need to feel able to be authentic. You can't imagine if you're frightened. Like your imagination from a neuroscience perspective shuts down. So creating the conditions for that is really fundamental. And so I've been doing that with people individually in one-to-one coaching, in teams and in systems in organizations. And now I'm really excited. I've started a collaboration with New Constellations. And like Rob said, they do amazing things that are really future-focused. And I'm so honored to be part of that. And it just so happens that when my collaboration started with them, the York journey happened, supported by Joseph Rowntree Foundation and actually the National Lottery Community Fund. And so I want to say a little bit about New Constellations and what we do, and then talk about the York journey. So New Constellations really exists in order to help people imagine and create a more beautiful future, a more beautiful world. That's really the fundamental driving force behind New Constellations. And it does that by taking people on journeys. And a journey is a metaphor for an experience, really, because that's what we've done for millennia. We've been kind of navigating by the stars. And so it's really finding new constellations to help us navigate by new constellations. And so we take people on journeys. They start with the status quo, what we're living in right now, and really confronting ourselves with the reality of the now moment. And then understanding the deep patterns, and I think many of you maybe didn't use that word, but spoke to that, the deep patterns and habits and behaviors that are ingrained in us right now that determine where we're going and to what extent we can or can't imagine. So really understanding that, then befriending ourselves with the level of uncertainty that comes when we let go of what we know, and start to reach out to something new, and then starting to imagine new stars that we want to be guided by to move into a future that is more beautiful, and then create the new world from there. And I think very often, I think what's amazing about those journeys is they really follow the journey that is required for us to imagine anew, rather than imagine with the old in mind, which I think we often do, and then we are surprised why we end up where we started when we had the best intentions, because we're still guided often by the old stars, I think. So that's what New Constellations does. And in York, we are, and we do these journeys in 3 different areas. One is in place, and we've run 2. I wasn't part of those, but we've run 2, one in Sheffield and one in Borough. And now it's coming to York, and we've just completed the recruitment for York. So we have 18 people. Talk a bit more about that. We also do systems journeys, so looking at the food system, for example, or the economic system or the financial system underpinning things, and kind of getting people who are involved in those systems together, and from a diverse group. It always has to be very diverse, I think, to bring the imagination from different people together. And then also leadership journeys, helping leaders to come together on a journey, and help them, go through that in order to imagine a better, more beautiful future. So yeah, we're doing a journey in July, so not long from now, in York, in collaboration with JRF. And we've just completed the recruitment process. We've got 18 people. The bit that I have to say, having worked kind of in the facilitation remit for the last 20, 25 years, the bit that I'm really excited about is 18 people that are and in York actually, very diverse group of people. I can honestly say that will be a group of people that I haven't been in a room, and I've been in many rooms, with such a diverse group of people, which is really exciting. And it does require creating the conditions for that group of people to be able to go on a journey together. Because we come with our ingrained views, perspectives. We trigger each other potentially. So we need to create the conditions for those people to be able to work together and imagine together. We've also learned, have I got a couple more minutes? We've also learned from previous journeys, that it's important to support these journeys beyond the journey itself, to make it really sustainable. It's not enough. The journey is very much a catalytic intervention that then needs to be supported to kind of put it, to grow and to expand into York. So this is 18 people. They are representative as far as that is possible with 18 people and a population of 200,000. But the idea is really what we've learned from previous journeys is that what comes after is really important. And JRF has put in funding and resource and support in order to make sure that there is support beyond the journey. And already we're thinking about how do we include the people who wanted to be part of the journey, but aren't. So because they're clearly also, these are all people who are passionate about York, all people who are already engaged in some form or other in York, and they want to grow that. So how do we engage those people? And then the idea is that ripples out into York. So it's a catalytic intervention that we're hoping very much will grow.
Thank you very much. And I feel like in your conversation that you've picked out a theme which I think is present actually in what everyone said about the need to create these sort of different spaces for us to be able to imagine alternatives and not get kind of caught up in, well, this just has to be the way things are, so we just need to make it a little bit less worse, but instead to kind of aim for something else. We're going to open it out to questions in a minute, but just while you think about your questions, I just want to actually come back to Rob, if that's all right. And Rob, I guess one of the things when I have conversations about imagination, particularly with people who are kind of very much in the kind of field of policy and politics and contemporary power, it's often, there's a slightly dismissive tone, let's say, about the importance of imagination, that it's seen as a bit of a luxury, as a bit of a sort of talking shop, when actually what we've really got to do is deal with the kind of urgent crises that are kind of filling the inboxes of, the local authority chief executives and senior civil servants and so on. And so I guess my question to you is, how can we make the case for imagination being an important part of our response to the moment we find ourselves in? How can we take it seriously in a world where very rationalistic thinking is sort of prioritised, where pragmatism is perhaps valued more than idealism and imagination? How do we get it taken seriously as an important part of the response to the crisis we're in?
Well, I think that's starting to move. I mean, like, I think the work that's happening in Camden is fascinating. I get invitations to visit lots of different organizations and projects and local and city governments who are really fascinated by this now, actually. And in the UK, something like 20% of our economy is what's called the creative sector. Which is bigger than aviation, car manufacturing, and life sciences combined. But we're in the process of designing imagination and creativity out of our education system almost entirely. So we're completely shooting ourselves in the foot at this particular point in time. I guess, when I go in and do work with organizations, my sense is that a lot of organizations realize that the urgency, that moving in the small little incremental steps is just completely pointless at this stage. They think we've left things so late. I recently went and spoke at a conference in Switzerland of 400 young people involved in organic food and farming, and the guy who spoke before me was from the biggest supermarket chain in Switzerland, and 4 times in his talk he said, "And I urge you all to be pragmatic." And I was sitting there thinking, my God, what are you doing to these kids? And when I got up, I said, and the first thing I said was, please, I'm here to urge you to please not be pragmatic. Be ridiculous, please. We don't need a whole next generation of people who are just focused on being pragmatic all the time. So my sense is that actually things like New Constellation, you know, is really interesting, because I was part of the one in Barrow, and my role in the New Constellations, they call my role being the salty sea dog, because they say that actually when you go off on a big adventure like the New Constellations is kind of modeling, often just before you set off on the journey, you might go to the bar on the quay, and you meet this salty sea dog who tells you all the tales of places he's been and experiences that he's had. And that's kind of my role, is to say, do you know, in Barcelona they're doing this, and in Utrecht they're doing this, and in Liège in Belgium they're doing this. And I feel like actually people often who work in, particularly in local government and city regional governments, are really hungry for that. And like, I go to a number of cities in France now who've elected green ecological administrations, who are striding ahead, doing really ambitious, completely reimagining the food systems for their cities, completely changing the way that they build, so they're building using local materials, really bringing imagination. In Bologna, the municipality in Bologna in Italy created what they called a civic imagination office, which, because they could see people were participating less in local democracy, a civic imagination office, 6 laboratories around the city, really well facilitated, bringing people together to create ideas. When the community come up with great ideas, the municipality will say to them, that's a good idea, let's make that happen. And they make pacts between the municipality and the people. So my sense is that actually doors to this stuff are much, much more open than they might have been 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Okay, over to all of you. What we'll probably do is take a few questions and then bring it back to the panel. So if you could put your hand up and wait for the microphone. We've got one over there.
Yeah, hi, really brilliant to hear from you all. I work in an organisation that's trying to do systems change in financial services. Battling the status quo every day can be tiring, and I think it can be really, really easy to take how the system works today and how everything works as normal into yourself as well, and lose some of that imagination. So really great to hear even more tips on how to keep your imagination going and keep that doing with our teams as well.
Thank you. Yes, I think, are there two? Yeah, two. So let's take you and then pass the microphone back.
Hi, my son has just recently moved from York to Sheffield. Mainly because of the inaffordability of housing in York. I was with him the other week and we were walking around Sheffield and we were talking about how easy it was to navigate Sheffield, and even though it's lots of hills. And he quoted something, I don't know the origin of the quote, but we were talking about walkable cities and things like that, and he said, and someone said, if the barista who serves your coffee in the city has to commute in because he can't afford to live in the city, you don't live in a city, you live in a theme park. And I do believe that York is becoming a theme park. What can we do to stop that actually happening?
Thank you.
Hi, my question is for Rob. Could you give us a little bit more steer or a little bit more around the ideas and the practicalities, the actions that people are taking in your French village you mentioned in your talk, and how they, if you like, the benefits are accruing to the poorest?
Great. Okay. So the comment about how tiring this work can be when you're kind of constantly having to resist that kind of gravitational pull of the status quo. Just giving you some things, maybe just choose one of the things you'd like to pick out. What can we do to stop York becoming a theme park? And then perhaps if between the three of you, you want to explore an aspect of that, and then we'll come to the question for Rob and the French villages.
Sure, happy to launch in. Sort of. Thanks, great questions. I was struck by what you said around the way you take it into yourself. working in these environments. I think we all do that. And I guess, you know, you were asking for sort of tips, how can we be sort of imaginative? And I want to say something that I think links to the point about, you know, potentially York as a theme park, is maybe we need to make the everyday strange. So, critical studies, which looks at power imbalances, it looks at racism, it looks at class, has recently, or maybe not recently, has sort of pivoted from an analysis of the people who are marginalized and oppressed to an analysis of the people in the positions of power. So an analysis of whiteness, an analysis of privilege. And I feel like that is part of the work that we need to be doing. So it's often what's not talked about in the room, that there is an imagination that is already in power, that is already constructing people and their lives as important or as not important, their voices as important or not as important. So my suggestion is that if you want to feel more imaginative, or if you want to challenge a city that you feel is sort of becoming a theme park, then sort of put on a new pair of spectacles to make the everyday strange and start sharing that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we all want system change, and we're all looking out there for it to happen, and we think we're fine. And I think the thing is, we are all part of the system. And so when we're seeking the change out there, I think we've got to start with us. And we are all swimming in this water that is, you know, all of the poly crisis. We're swimming all in that water, and we're all impacted by it in one way or another. There's that beautiful Zen story of two young fish swimming along in the water and an old fish kind of coming their way. And the old fish says, "Beautiful water today." And one of the young looks to the other one as he passes and goes, "What water?" And I think that's what we're in. We're not realizing that we ourselves are in it. And so I think that's where it has to start. It has to start, I always say, self-work, inner work is world work right now. Self-work is world work right now. And so each of us, rather than kind of thinking about what can I change out there, where have I not got it integrated? Where do I need to look? How am I relating to this? All of the time, I think. And it's a really challenging kind of place to come from, but I think that's what we're all called to doing. And I think that's where it starts. And that is what the journey does. It confronts people with their own patterns. We can't change the patterns out there if we're not looking here. And that's partly pretty painful. But that is what we have to do, I think.
Just to pick up on the theme park question, I wonder, I mean, because in lots of ways, I guess this idea of York as a theme park, it builds on some sort of perceived successes of York as a kind of tourist destination and so on. And part of what the New Constellations work might uncover is some alternative ideas of what York is really about and what it could be about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that's really what we're trying to do. And we're very conscious of that as a starting point. And the group will look at that individually as individuals, as well as, I'm sure, as a group as well. And, you know, what we want is solutions. And that's part of the old system, actually. We want to go, we're here, this is what we can put in, and if we can see it from here, I think Rob had a beautiful quote, or was it you, Jake, that was, if we can see it now, it is not the future. Like, it's the future that is built on what we're already doing. So what we're trying to do is, we haven't got the answers. If we had them, it would be easy and we would have done it. But that's very much what we're trying to do, is helping people imagine different ways of operating. I think it's all very emergent, but that is what we're hoping will come out of the York project. I don't think there's a magic answer to it.
And with a much more diverse group of voices.
Yeah, much more diverse group of voices. So I think that's really unique, what we're doing here. And I haven't been in a room with such a diverse group of people. I'm super excited about that. They literally come from all walks of life. They are all ages, different, genders, sexual orientation. It's like very, very mixed. And people who normally, one of the things that I've heard in speaking to people was it tends to be the same people who are in the room in York. I think that was one of the things that we were really conscious of, needing to not be the same people in the room. And it really isn't the same people in the room, so that we can create something very new and emergent. But I don't think there's an answer. That's the frustrating thing, I think, and that's the difficult thing, I think, that there isn't this is where we're going, because if we were going there, it wouldn't be the future that we want.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll pick up on the finance and then come to the theme park, because that's an insightful observation about York, I think. On the finance, I've been lucky and privileged enough, because of my work in fair trade, to work with some very imaginative finance organisations, Triodos Bank, Oiko Credit in the Netherlands, and obviously crowdsourcing, crowdfunding have all been really, really useful ways of getting imaginative ideas off the ground, because mainstream finance doesn't really understand that imagination. So I'm glad that the finance sector is moving in a more imaginative direction. In the theme park, when you mentioned theme park, it reminded me of somewhere like Venice, because that's also regarded as a kind of theme park. I do agree with the panel. It's so systems, or it's a systems problem, and for far too long we've looked at these problems in a siloed way, in a kind of we've looked at housing, we've looked at decent work, we've looked at what else did I put down here? We've looked at city design. We looked at them we haven't integrated them together, and I think new constellations could potentially do that. I'm in favour of tourism tax. That's what they've done in Venice, to actually invest in solving some of these. How you administer it, I don't know, but I would be in favour. I would be in favour of that, and York Central might provide a opportunity. The big brownfield site development might be an opportunity to do something different within a city, other than, if you look at those big brownfield site developments recently, King's Cross being a good example, it isn't imaginative. So I think we've got an opportunity in York to do something very, very radical and very different. But that gentleman who observed that, it's a very insightful observation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, York Central as not King's Cross seems like a good starting point for
yeah, because you might have those same people in the room, so I think, yeah, let's be ambitious. Ambition is one word I think comes out of today. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Rob. Rob, tell us more about the French villages.
Well, it's a French city called Grand Sainte, which is near Dunkirk. So it's on the northwest coast of Dunkirk. And I went there a few years ago, and there was a man called Damien Carême, who was the mayor there, who was an amazing visionary, very motivated about climate. And his thinking was, everything you do about climate change has to be of service to the poorest people in the city. So they introduced low energy street lighting and saved about 600,000 euros off their annual energy bills. And rather than just pocket the difference, they then distributed that money as an income boost to the poorest people in the city. So they felt the benefit of the shift towards decarbonizing the city. They make all the social housing they build is passive house. All the public transport in the center of the city is completely free. Around the poorest housing areas, they took up all the concrete and tarmac to enable people to make food gardens. And it was just it was amazing to see, because it was just after Macron had done that stupid thing with putting the tax on diesel that kicked off the whole Gilets jaunes thing. And people were then very reluctant about, oh, well, everything we do about climate change is going to hurt the poorest people. Actually, nonsense. It should be that everything we do about climate change is about improving the lives of the poorest people in society. And just to speak a little bit on the gentrification question, on the sort of theme park question, well, I'm speaking to you from Totnes, where we have a very, very similar challenge, huge levels of second home ownership, a massive, massive housing crisis going on here. And I think there's a couple of things that I would say. One of the ways that we should be addressing that is through adopting the kind of model that the city council in Preston are using. I think when people put the word model after the name of your city, it generally indicates you're doing something quite good. So I think that Preston model and that idea that you're trying to recalibrate the economy of a city so that it enables money to circulate as many times within that city as possible is really important, and using the procurement power of universities, schools, hospitals to drive a kind of a new economy like I've seen happening in some places in France as well. I think tackling, Bob mentioned the tourist tax. I think also the kind of work they're doing in Barcelona to try and rein in the kind of Airbnb-ification of that city is really important. But the example that I would give from Totnes, which is something that I've been involved, a project I've been involved with for far too long, about 14 years, is a project called Atmos Totnes, where the community is working hard to become the developer of an 8-acre former industrial brownfield site right next to the train station in our town. And it's a story that will one day make a fantastic Netflix series because it has some great bad guys in it. And it's a story about a really determined community. In fact, it's on the front page of our local paper again today because the very unscrupulous people who bought it I've just put in a new planning application, which we are fighting, and we're trying to move our district council towards the compulsory purchase of the site so that the scheme that was designed by the community in a town of 9,000 people, more than 4,000 people contributed to that consultation. We got planning permission through a referendum using the community right to build order power, and we were scandalously robbed at the last minute when we were just about to sign the contracts to buy the site, and it was sold to a private company. The powers of compulsory purchase, I think, are not used anywhere near enough. And I feel like that we need to be bringing in something where if a community can show that it has consulted widely and that it's had some kind of a community referendum to show the majority of people want those plans to go ahead, then that community organization who has done that should acquire the power of compulsory purchase itself, so that we can then see the communities mobilizing and unlocking brownfield sites, and with some kind of imaginative finance coming in to support those things, it could be a really radical thing. Because fundamentally, all the things that we try and do in the transition movement, building a new food economy, greening cities, greening towns, all this kind of stuff, ultimately, unless we put in place the affordable housing that means people can stay there, become a driver of gentrification. So, and we know that the market is not going to provide those kind of houses. So that model where we as communities, inspired by things like Coin Street Community Builders on the South Street, on the South Bank in London, those kind of projects, I think, are something we need a huge amount more of, and is something that we're working very hard here. And hopefully by the end of the year, we will have moved our council to doing a compulsory purchase order. We just elected in the last local elections, having had a Tory majority council forever, elected a Lib Dem majority council who ran with the compulsory purchase of that site as one of their 5 key policies in the election. So we're getting very close, and I think this idea that communities become their own developers is one of the key ways that we can address that sort of Disneyfication of our towns.
Thanks, Rob. We are very nearly at time. It's flown by. So just to finish things off, I'd like to make sure that everybody leaves this room with a sense of hope and possibility, and hopefully a sense of the ridiculous that we all carry around, maybe to encourage you to cultivate that. But just to finish us off, it'd be great just to hear from all 4 of you about what is giving you hope right now. And Bob, I'd like to start with you.
I think I go to our work in Fix Our Food in schools. Just young people, we actually got them to, they came up with the idea, but we provided the facilities to actually, for them to do a video that they wanted to send to Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister. And honestly, if I had the time to show the video, it's just brilliant. The ideas they come up with about what their food should look like in the school, what their food environment, what their curriculum should look like, food being central in the culture of the school, more time for lunch hour, so they don't have only 20 minutes to eat their food. They giving young people a voice and getting them to imagine that future by getting them to do films about it. I'm not sure Boris Johnson ever watched it, but if he did, hopefully it would have an impact on him.
Great. So. Thank you. Yasmin, what about you?
Well, I think there's so much hope in all of the stories, and there's like once you start digging it for and you get into this subject of, you know, the future and what's possible and what are people doing. There's so many people doing so much stuff. I mean, how can we not be hopeful? And I think it's becoming more and more, and it's starting to connect with one another, is my sense as well. Like, people are starting to reach out to each other. I'm doing this, you're doing this, why don't we kind of work together? And so there's a system developing, which I think is really, really creating hope for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me it's a feeling that I get when I'm with people. So I think when we enter into these spaces of imagination, I see people blossom, really. There's a sense of a kind of relaxation in a connection that I see people start building and start making things together instead of living in this place of fear, that we start building in this place where actually we've got agency and we can do things together. So I probably smell a little bit of wood smoke because I've recently come from a camp with a set of young people who live in inner city London, and we were spending some time doing nature connection and imagination with the wild, with not just the humans but other beings that actually we've evolved with for billions of years, and watching them transform from fear of touching the moss to being really kind of thrilled about this thing that they were on with us was just really beautiful. And you know, we see that when we're working with young people, when we're working with civil servants, you know, people in NGOs. We just it's a beautiful thing. So it's that sense of the possibility of opening up that I think gives me hope.
Thank you. And Rob?
Thank you. Yeah, I think like hope, like imagination, is ideally something that we do together with other people. It should be a shared thing. When people say, give me one thing we can all do, it's like, that's the wrong question. The question is, how do we get together? And like New Constellations is such a beautiful example of that. I think what gives me hope is that I have the great privilege of traveling around and meeting loads of groups and community organizations who are doing things. And one that I went to the other day in Marseille, in the north of Marseille, which if you've been to Marseille, you probably didn't go to the north of Marseille. And it's a very high levels of unemployment and crime and drugs and very impoverished, many undocumented people there. And in 2014, the French government subsidized McDonald's to open a McDonald's there, so it would make some jobs. And it ran for 5 years. And in 2019, the French government said, well, we subsidized you to run it for 5 years now. You'll probably be all right. So McDonald's said, well, we'll shut it then. And they closed it just before the pandemic. 72 jobs were lost. And there was a guy who was the manager who still had the keys. And so he opened that building up and they turned it into a food bank. They gave out 2,000 food parcels a week. They called it Après M. They rearranged all the letters. So it said Après M on the roof, after M. And they now have reopened it. So then after a year and a half of that, the municipality in Marseille bought them the building. They have now opened it as what they call a fast social food restaurant, and they serve it. It's like a McDonald's, but if you haven't got any money, they'll just give you it for nothing, and they source stuff locally. It's ethical. It's just the most incredible thing. So I go and see somewhere like that. And when you walk out into the sunshine, having been somewhere like that, how can you possibly feel, oh, nothing's possible, it's all too late, we can't do anything? Of course we can.
Thank you. So, another world is possible, and maybe we should have added, and it is happening. So I hope you've taken some inspiration from today. I hope it's given you some space to think about your own place and imagination in shaping those futures that we all dream of. We have some books for sale here. There's another panel happening at 4:30. I'm also chairing that, but we've got some other fantastic speakers asking who gets to imagine the future. So do please stay for that. And of course, this is the first day of 2 weeks of an amazing range of events and gatherings of the York Festival of Ideas. Most of the events are free. You can book all the tickets online. So just get stuck in. There's so many things on the programme I'd love to go to. So I think that's everything I needed to do there. So the only last thing is to say thank you to all of you for coming, but of course a huge thank you to our wonderful panel today for being here.